My presentation will be about the rise and fall of the steel and coal industry in the Rust Belt and how it affected all the cities and states surrounding it. The Rust Belt is a term used to describe the region stretching from New York to the Midwest that was once dominated by the coal and steel industry. Some states that were affected and included in this were New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Detroit. The flourishing of industrial manufacturing in the region was caused in part by the proximity to the Great Lakes, waterways, paved roads, canals, and railroads. After the transportation infrastructure linked the iron in the northern mountains of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, soon it developed into the factory belt with its shipping lanes connecting cities like Chicago, Buffalo, Detroit, Milwaukee, Cleveland, and many others. In 1869, iron was already a major industry in the U.S., accounting for 6.6% of manufacturing employment and 7.8% of manufacturing output. The main figure in this was Andrew Carnegie. He was based out of Pittsburgh, and he was the leader in the steel industry in the U.S. at this time. From 1875 to 1920, American steel production grew from 380,000 tons to 60 million tons annually, which is a huge increase in that amount of time, and it made U.S. the world leader by a far margin. The annual growth rates in steel from 1870 to 1913 were 7% in the U.S., 1% in Britain, 4% in France, and 4% in Germany. So by those numbers, we were ahead of the steel industry in the world by a lot. Most people think that the decline of the Rust Belt started in the 1970s, but it actually started in the 1950s. During that time, the region's dominant industries faced virtually no product or labor competition, which you would think is a good thing, but it actually wasn't, because these companies became monopolies in their steel and coal and railroad industries. So they didn't innovate or try to get better. They kind of just flattened out. Then after the 1980s, the competitive pressure increased and the production shift more to the Southern America and internationally with imports. This slowed the decline because then these big companies had to innovate and had to change their ways. The decline of the Rust Belt changed lives of millions of people around the Great Lakes. A striving city like Buffalo went from 580,000 people in 1950 to 256 people in 2015. A big city like Detroit went from 1.8 million in 1950 to 672,000 in 2015. Cleveland, Ohio, another big Rust Belt city, went from 914,000 to all the way down to 380,000. The decline of the Rust Belt and the transfer of jobs overseas and to the South threw millions of people out of work and into the streets. The financial and economic effects of this were huge. From 1979 to 1982, the U.S. Fed decided to raise the base interest rate in the U.S. from 19%. High interest rates attracted wealthy foreign hot money to U.S. banks and caused the U.S. dollar to appreciate. This made U.S. products more expensive for foreigners to buy and also made imports much cheaper for Americans to purchase. The misaligned exchange was not changed until 1986, and by that time, Japanese imports in particular had made rapid inroads into U.S. markets. This led to people buying international products cheaper than they would buy U.S. products, and that led to a big drop in all U.S. products, but especially steel and iron. From 1987 to 1999, the U.S. stock market went into a stratospheric rise and has continued to pull wealthy foreign money into U.S. banks, which bias the exchange rate against manufactured goods. Related issues include the decline of iron and steel industry, the movement of manufacturing again to the south with lower labor costs, and international with even lower labor costs. The layoffs due to the rise in automation of the industrial process and the decreased need for labor in the making steel products was caused by the innovations of new machines in factories that caused automation, especially in the steel and car industries. That's where, especially in Detroit, was a huge layoffs and huge unemployment rates because car industries now started to have automation machines to make their cars. Cities struggling with these conditions shared several factors, including population loss, lack of education, declining tax revenues, high unemployment and crime, drugs, welfare, and poor municipal credit ratings. These cities took a real hit when factories didn't need as many employees as they did in the past. Unemployment rates in the Rust Belt and across the Great Lakes are still feeling the effects of automation of the steel and car industries. While the rest of the country is recovering from unemployment, the Rust Belt still has an unemployment rate of up to 15% compared to 6% to the rest of the country. That's a big difference when you're talking about millions of people. And this is because blue collar jobs have increasingly moved overseas. It's cheaper and it's less labor costs for businesses to do this. And this is forcing local governments to rethink the type of manufacturing business that can succeed in the area. While some cities manage to adopt new technologies, others still struggle with rising poverty levels and declining populations. Some cities have come back from the Rust Belt decline of the late 1900s and have revived their city. I'm from Buffalo, and that's why I wanted to do this presentation because my grandpa actually worked for Bethlehem Steel and was part of the whole Rust Belt industry in the late 1900s and lost his job because of it. Now, after a couple decades, Buffalo has finally come back from it and has revamped the waterfront, revamped all the old buildings that used to be used as this, and is finally increasing in population and becoming what it once was before. There are cities on the other end of this that are still feeling the effects from the decline of the Rust Belt and car and steel industry, such as Detroit, where population continues to go down and crime rates go up. The steel and iron industries brought millions of people to the Great Lakes and the Rust Belt and basically created cities such as Buffalo, Pittsburgh, Detroit, and Cleveland. It made it well known across the country and the world, but the decline of these industries almost crushed these cities, and it has taken decades for these cities to come back to what they once were. The Rust Belt is a very prominent location for presidential candidates to do speeches and to try to win the people over because the people in these cities want them to go back to their glory and want jobs to come back. So politicians spend a lot of time there and promise things and promise jobs to the people in these cities. The cities and the people in the Rust Belt will never go back to what it once was in the early 1900s, but it is good to see the economic effects and how they are increasing finally in the 21st century, and the outlook for the cities in this area are finally back on the right path.